A crowd of determined protesters, chanting in unison, blocking every route, every possible path. Their voices rise with intensity, fueled by a single goal: to stop Barron Trump from making it through. They think they have the situation under control, but something is about to shift. The sound of roaring engines fills the air, the rumble unmistakable. One by one, a group of bikers rolls in, a sea of leather and chrome, each rider with a mission. In the blink of an eye, everything changes. What happens when these two worlds collide? You're about to find out. The crowd around the event was buzzing with excitement, a political rally set against the backdrop of a crisp afternoon. Barron Trump, the son of the current president, was about to make a rare appearance. His name alone drew attention, and there was no doubt the atmosphere was charged. But something else was brewing just a few feet away, something unexpected. The protesters had gathered with a purpose. Armed with signs, they were shouting slogans, their voices competing with the distant sound of cheers. You could feel their energy in the air, their conviction clear. They weren't just protesting for any cause, they were protesting against Barron Trump himself. Every inch of the street had become a battleground. It wasn't just about ideas, it was about stopping him, from stepping into this event. Tension grew, their chants rising in volume and intensity, blocking every route Barron could take. It was an all-out attempt to halt his progress, and it seemed they were winning. The protesters believed they had control over the situation. But that's when something extraordinary happened. As the protesters stood firm, something changed in the air. The low hum of an approaching noise turned into a deafening roar. The sound was unmistakable, the rumbling of motorcycles. One after another, powerful machines pulled into view. Riders in leather jackets, helmets reflecting the sun, their faces hidden beneath the visors. A group of bikers appeared, rolling in from the distance. They weren't here for any protest, and they certainly weren't interested in being a part of the disruption. What they were about to do was something none of the protesters expected. Imagine this, a sea of people, shouting, arms raised high, blocking the way, thinking their mission was near complete. Then, boom, the sound of engines takes over. The atmosphere shifts in an instant. The bikers didn't come for a fight, but their presence alone was enough to turn the tide. So, what happens when two completely different forces meet? One focused on protest, the other on solidarity? The protesters, loud and firm, now faced a group that wasn't afraid to stand their ground. What happens next is beyond what anyone could have predicted. Before we get to that, we want to know, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more updates. Your support really helps us keep bringing you these stories. But let's return to the moment. Can you feel the suspense? What happens when these bikers make their move? The protesters had gathered with a clear purpose, each one driven by their beliefs, fueled by personal conviction. Some were there because they saw Barron Trump as the embodiment of everything they opposed. For others, this was a broader fight, one that extended beyond the Trump name and into a battle over what they believed the country stood for. Each one had their reasons, but all were united in their goal to make sure Barron Trump did not reach the stage where his appearance was awaited. The air was thick with tension as their chants grew louder, their presence undeniable. They weren't just a group of people, they were a unified force, moving in sync, their determination matching the rising volume of their voices. Every sign held high, every movement in perfect coordination. They were determined to keep Barron from getting through. But as the minutes passed, their frustration became evident. The closer Barron Trump came to the rally site, the more the protesters pushed to keep him from getting any closer. The space around them grew more and more congested, every path blocked. The protesters had been waiting for this moment, and now they were ready to make their mark. What they hadn't counted on, however, was the bikers. As the protesters continued to press forward, the air around Barron Trump grew heavy with the sound of their voices. Every step he took was met with resistance, each move slower than the last. The closer he got to his destination, the more confined he felt. Just as things seemed to reach a boiling point, the sound of motorcycles roared through the crowd. The engines rumbled with a power that seemed to echo through the tense atmosphere. One by one, the bikers appeared, moving steadily into position. The group of riders was no longer lingering at the edge of the crowd, but now they were stepping forward, forming a visible presence between Barron and the protesters. For a moment, there was a brief pause, as if the air itself had been held in suspension. The bikers and protesters stood face to face, the tension palpable. It was as if the two groups were about to collide, but in that moment, no one moved. The sound of engines grew louder again, but now there was a different energy in the air, one that felt as though something was about to break. Barron Trump's path was still blocked, but with the bikers taking their stand, a shift began to happen. The protesters had thought they were in control, but now there was an unpredictable element in play. The bikers weren't just a spectacle, they were a force, and they were unyielding. What would happen when these two groups, so different in purpose and action, came into direct contact? What do you think will happen next? As the bikers close in, will they manage to clear a way for Barron Trump? Or will the protesters hold their ground? This moment is critical, and how it unfolds could change the course of the day. As the protesters shouted and waved their signs, the situation seemed to be at its boiling point. Every chant, every movement, felt like it was pushing the event toward an inevitable conflict. Barron Trump, surrounded by his security, was unable to proceed. The protesters were relentless, their voices piercing the air. But then, everything changed. The sudden roar of motorcycle engines shattered the charged atmosphere. It wasn't just one or two bikes, but a whole group, appearing out of nowhere, their engines thundering like an approaching storm. The sound was almost deafening, echoing across the space, drawing the attention of everyone present. The bikers rolled in, fast and purposeful, each motorcycle gleaming under the bright lights, their riders clad in leather jackets. The unmistakable presence of the riders was undeniable. Their faces, set with a determined resolve, revealed they weren't just another group of bystanders. No, these bikers were there for a reason. As they came closer, the crowd parted slightly, almost instinctively. Their steady pace and the synchronized growl of their engines made it clear, this was no random appearance. The bikers weren't just showing up, they were making a statement. The protesters, still on edge and fiercely vocal, now found themselves facing an unexpected challenge. The bikers were not just a diversion. They were a shift in power. A change in energy that none of them had anticipated. For a moment, the crowd paused. The chanting slowed. The energy, once so focused on the mission to block Barron Trump, now seemed to falter. The bikers didn't say a word, but their presence spoke volumes. The protesters, initially unshaken, now seemed uncertain. There was a hesitation in their movements. Their chants softened, their signs lowering slightly. What had been an unwavering wave of noise and resolve now faced an immovable force. The bikers didn't engage in the same noisy protests. They didn't shout or wave anything. They simply stood there, a physical and symbolic wall between the protesters and Barron Trump. Calm, yet undeniably powerful, their message wasn't spoken, it was felt. The contrast was striking. The protesters, who had been loud, animated, and fiery, now found themselves up against a force of quiet strength. The bikers didn't need to raise their voices. They didn't need to shout over the crowd. They stood firm, with an unspoken promise that they weren't going anywhere. The protesters were used to controlling the narrative, to commanding the moment with their passion and energy. But now, the balance was shifting. What do you think will happen now? Will the protesters back down? Can they hold their ground against this new, unexpected force? Or will the bikers' sheer presence be enough to shift the tides? Think about it, sometimes power doesn't need to be loud to be effective. In this scenario, the quiet strength of the bikers might just be the game changer. But what happens when two forces with completely different motives collide? Who holds the upper hand? The bikers stand unmoving, like a solid wall. Their leather jackets gleam in the sunlight, the roaring engines silenced, but their presence speaks louder than any protester's chant could. As the protesters continue to shout, their voices now sound almost distant, as if the force in front of them has somehow stolen their power. A few protesters yell out, "You're not helping anyone," or "Get out of here," but the bikers remain unaffected. No words. Just a powerful, unyielding silence. This silence, it feels heavier now than the loudest chants. It's not just a physical presence, it's the energy in the air, the tension that's palpable, yet unspoken. Each biker stands tall, their eyes fixed forward. The protesters, once energized by their cause, now find themselves questioning their next move. Their eyes dart between one another, uncertainty starting to take root. In the midst of the protest, a woman steps forward, holding a sign that reads, "Stop the tyranny." She shakes her fist toward one of the bikers. "You don't know what this country needs," she screams. The biker remains still, his face expressionless. The moment feels suspended in time, each person locked in a moment of decision, unsure of what will happen next. And then, another protester shouts, "Why don't you join us? We're all fighting for what's right." The words come with a raw intensity, a frustration born of feeling unheard. But the bikers, still unmoving, do not respond. They simply stand there, their silence more powerful than any words could ever be. It's clear, they're not here to argue. They're here to stand firm. The protesters' chants, once so loud, now seem to lose their bite. The bikers' silent defiance weighs on them. What happens when an unyielding presence confronts the force of conviction? Does the loudest voice always win? Or is there strength in simply standing still? The crowd, previously energized by their unified goal, begins to slow down. Some look at each other, unsure if they should advance or retreat. Others start to murmur, exchanging uneasy glances. The bikers are unmoving. As the protesters glance nervously at one another, it becomes clear that this isn't going the way they planned. The tension is undeniable. Barron Trump is still trapped behind the protesters, but now the bikers have become a new obstacle in the way. The protesters are starting to feel the pressure. What was once an organized demonstration is now filled with doubt. Are they really prepared to face down a group like this? Just then, one protester, a man in his 30s, steps forward. He gestures toward the bikers and says, "You think you're going to stop us with your bikes? You think this will change anything?" His voice is growing louder, more frustrated. But his eyes can't hide the uncertainty creeping in. He takes a few steps forward, trying to engage with the bikers. And then something happens that no one expects. One of the bikers, the leader perhaps, slowly turns his head toward the man. The sudden movement causes the crowd to pause. He doesn't speak. But the look in his eyes is enough to silence the protester. It's not a threat, it's something else. Something heavier. The protester swallows hard, his words dying in his throat. And in that moment, the power dynamics shift. The bikers have not only stopped the progress of the protesters, but have created a space where words fall silent. This silent, firm resolve is enough to make even the most vocal protesters hesitate. Now, think about this. What does it mean to stand your ground in the face of a challenge? The protesters thought they were in control, determined to push forward. But the bikers, who didn't engage in the shouting, the signs, or the noise, have shifted the entire atmosphere. What do you believe is more powerful in a confrontation, loud words or quiet determination? Do you think the bikers' strategy was more effective, or could the protesters have found a way to regain control? We want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Is there something to be learned from this moment? Could the bikers have resolved the situation differently? Could the protesters have turned the tide? The standoff lingers, but the atmosphere is changing. The bikers, unmoving, continue to stand tall like sentinels, their leather jackets catching the light as the sun begins to dip lower in the sky. The protesters, once so unified and loud, start to shift uneasily. It's as if the bikers' stillness has a gravitational pull, forcing a retreat that no one expected. One by one, a few protesters begin to back off. Their shoulders slump, the fire in their voices fading. The chants become less aggressive, more uncertain. The bikers haven't raised a fist, but their mere presence has started to dissolve the protesters' resolve. Their collective unity is breaking, and what once felt like an immovable barricade is starting to crumble. "Are we really going to stand here all day?" a protester mutters, looking to his comrades. He's no longer speaking with the same conviction as before. Another person, a woman holding a large sign, slowly lowers it. Her eyes flicker from the bikers to her fellow protesters, then back to the unmoving figures. She exhales deeply, almost as if accepting the situation for what it is. The force of the bikers' presence has rendered words unnecessary. The leaders of the protest, who moments ago were at the front shouting demands, begin to look at each other, questioning the next step. Some exchange unsure glances, while others, with furrowed brows, start to fade into the crowd. It's not fear that drives them back, it's the realization that they can't push through this quiet but undeniable force. Without a single fist thrown, without a word spoken in anger, the bikers have achieved what seemed impossible. The protesters, with their passionate cries and loud demands, find themselves unable to penetrate this silent wall of resistance. One by one, they begin to retreat, their voices trailing off. The space between the bikers and the protesters widens, the crowd's intensity fading into the background. What happens when the loudest voices are met with unshakable stillness? What if the true power lies not in raising your voice, but in the strength to remain silent, to stand firm when everything else is in motion? That is the power the bikers have shown. And the protesters, who once seemed invincible in their convictions, now find themselves questioning the cost of their actions. The bikers haven't shouted, they haven't moved a muscle to intimidate. But their refusal to bend has shaken the protesters' certainty. The rallying cries of protest grow softer. The energy that once fueled the crowd now dissipates, like a fog lifting as the sun breaks through. One of the protest leaders, a young man in his late 20s, takes a long look at the bikers. His hand clenches around his sign, but he doesn't raise it. Instead, he slowly turns to his team. The change in his demeanor is subtle, but it's there. There's a quiet resignation in his eyes now. The tension that once seemed endless is finally starting to ease. He steps back and nods toward the others. "We're not getting through this today," he says, his voice lacking the fire it had moments ago. With a collective sigh, the protesters start to disperse, some walking away, others hesitating for a moment longer, as if waiting for permission to let go of the fight. It's interesting, isn't it? How often do we see a situation escalate to a breaking point, only for it to be diffused not through conflict, but through the strength of remaining steady? The bikers' simple presence has shifted the course of this event. They didn't raise their fists, but their refusal to be moved was enough to sway an entire crowd. How often do we, in our own lives, feel the pressure to shout louder, to push harder, only to find that sometimes the greatest strength is in simply standing your ground? What do you think? Is there power in silence? Could this approach work in other situations, or is it something that only works under certain circumstances? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective on what the bikers' actions really represented. As the protesters begin to disperse, the bikers remain where they are. Their job, it seems, is done. Barron Trump, who has been quietly observing from behind the line of protesters, begins to make his way through the crowd, escorted safely by his security. The moment is almost anticlimactic, but there's a sense of relief in the air, a realization that the situation has been resolved without violence, without escalation. But what lessons can we draw from this? Was it about strength? Was it about strategy? Or was it a reminder that sometimes it's not about being louder, it's about being steadfast in your beliefs and unyielding in your actions? As the last of the bikers rev up their engines and fade into the distance, the heavy weight of the moment starts to settle. The protesters, no longer unified in their fervor, disperse, leaving behind a near-empty street. Barron Trump, who had been silently observing the scene from the safety of his security perimeter, continues with his scheduled appearance. His face is calm, his expression unchanged. It's almost as if the earlier chaos had never occurred. The crowds have thinned, but there's something in the air, a lingering thought that's hard to shake. The bikers, with nothing more than their resolute presence, shifted the course of the event. They didn't make a sound, but their actions spoke volumes. And as the sun sets and the final few protesters slip into the shadows, you can almost feel a collective exhale from everyone who witnessed this remarkable turn of events. But was it really over? Or did it leave us questioning the power of silence? The bikers may have vanished into the distance, but their influence remains etched in the minds of everyone present. The impact of their actions wasn't just in what they did, but in how they made others reconsider their course. The protesters, once brimming with energy, now look back at the bikers' unflinching stance and realize something: they hadn't anticipated this. For Barron Trump, there were no words of gratitude or praise from the crowd. He remained focused on his goal, moving forward as planned. No official statement came, no acknowledgement of the bikers' intervention. It was as though this moment was simply another in a long string of political events. Yet, beneath the surface, something had shifted. A quiet shift that would not go unnoticed. But what does this moment really tell us? In a world where loud protests, massive rallies, and heated exchanges often dominate the headlines, here we saw something different. The bikers didn't challenge the protesters with violence. They didn't shout to be heard. They didn't fight fire with fire. They stood firm, silently, with an unwavering conviction that said, "This is our line, and we will not cross it." And somehow, that was enough. The message here isn't just about physical strength or intimidation, it's about the power of resolve, the strength to stand firm when everyone else seems to be pushing in a different direction. How often do we get caught up in the noise and the pressure to act or react? What would it look like if, instead of rushing to confront every challenge head-on, we simply held our ground? For Barron Trump, this event was just another day. But for those watching, whether from the streets or from their screens, the underlying message of the bikers' actions may resonate much longer than the event itself. Do we need to fight for our beliefs, or is the ability to simply remain unshaken enough to change the course of events? What role does patience and strength play in moments of chaos? How often do we forget that sometimes our most powerful weapon is our ability to stand our ground, to stay calm and unwavering while everything else swirls around us? Now, as we look back on this event, we have to ask ourselves, what does it really mean to stand firm in our beliefs? How often do we think that noise and action are the only ways to make a difference? The bikers didn't raise their voices, but their message was heard loud and clear. What are your thoughts on the bikers' actions? Do you believe that standing firm, in silence and strength, can be just as powerful as any vocal protest? How would you have reacted in their shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue this conversation. If you found this story engaging, thought-provoking, or simply intriguing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Let's keep discussing what it really means to stand firm in the face of adversity. Sometimes, the quietest actions leave the biggest impact. Stay tuned for more.